They didn't just find one, they found hundreds. Across America, buried in mounds, hidden in caves, unearthed by farmers and railroad crews, newspapers once reported something that should have changed everything. Human skeletons, 7, 8, even 9 feet tall. Not myths, not legends. Documented, measured, published, and then silence. No museum displays, no scientific breakthroughs, no trace of the bones that were supposedly shipped to the most powerful institution in the country. It's as if an entire chapter of human history was erased. So here's the question no one wants to answer. If over 300 reports of giant human skeletons were real, where did they all go? I wasn't looking for giants. At least, not at first. My research began in a place that felt safe, 19th century archaeology. Early excavations, the era before strict academic control, when discoveries were made by farmers, surveyors, railroad workers, ordinary people who didn't need permission to dig into the ground beneath their feet. It was a time when the past wasn't yet locked behind institutions, when history was still being uncovered in raw, unfiltered fragments. I was trying to understand how people back then saw themselves, what they believed about human origins before everything became standardized, before textbooks, before rigid theories, before certain questions quietly became off-limits. That's when I found the first article. It was buried in a digitized newspaper archive. Small, easy to miss, just a local report about a discovery during excavation work. But one line caught my attention: a human skeleton, over 7 feet tall. I paused. Not because it was impossible, but because of how casually it was written. No dramatic language, no attempt to convince the reader, just a straightforward observation, recorded the same way you'd report crop prices or a town meeting. I assumed it was an outlier, a mistake maybe, or an exaggeration. Then I found another, and another. Within hours, I wasn't reading a single strange report, I was staring at a pattern. Different states, different years, different newspapers, and yet the same claim repeated over and over again. Unusually large human skeletons, often described with precise measurements: 7 feet 4 inches, 8 feet 2, sometimes even taller. These weren't vague estimates, they were specific, deliberate, the kind of numbers people write down when they've actually measured something. And the tone never changed. No sensational headlines, no disbelief, just quiet documentation. It didn't feel like fiction. It felt like routine. That's when curiosity turned into something else. Because if these reports were real, even partially real, then they should have led somewhere. There should have been follow-up studies, academic debates, museum exhibits. Discoveries like this don't just disappear. But as I kept digging, I noticed something far stranger than the reports themselves. They stopped. Not gradually, not fading out over time. They just ended. Around the early 20th century, the articles vanished from mainstream newspapers almost completely. It was as if editors across the country had collectively decided, without ever saying it out loud, that these discoveries were no longer worth mentioning. And yet, excavation didn't stop. People were still digging. Archaeology was becoming more advanced, more professional, more systematic than ever before. So why did the reports disappear? That question stayed with me. I started collecting everything I could find, every clipping, every reference, every detail. I wasn't trying to prove anything. Not yet. I just wanted to understand what I was looking at. But the more I gathered, the harder it became to dismiss. Because this wasn't one story. It was hundreds, and they all described the same thing. Human remains that were unmistakably human, but wrong in scale. Too large, too consistent, too widespread to ignore. At some point, without realizing it, my research had changed. I was no longer studying archaeology. I was chasing a question, one that felt increasingly uncomfortable the deeper I went. What happens when evidence doesn't fit the story we've already decided is true? And more importantly, what happens to that evidence? Because somewhere between those quiet newspaper reports and the present day, something had gone missing. Not just the bones, but the memory that they were ever found at all. Once I realized this wasn't a single anomaly, I stopped reading casually. I started tracking every article, every location, every measurement. I built a growing archive of newspaper clippings from the mid to late 1800s small-town publications, regional papers, and occasionally major outlets. At first, it felt like assembling scattered fragments. But the more I collected, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't random. It was repetition. An excavation in one state would uncover a skeleton described as of enormous proportions. A few years later, hundreds of miles away, another report would describe nearly identical remains, same unusual height, same oversized skull, same careful burial context. Then another, and another. Different reporters, different decades, no connection between them. Yet the descriptions aligned with unsettling precision. One article detailed a skeleton over 8 feet tall, discovered during railway construction. Another described multiple large skeletons found in a burial mound, arranged deliberately, suggesting ritual or status. In yet another, farmers digging a well-uncovered bone so large that the skull alone was described as twice the size of a normal man's. And none of these reports treated the discoveries as impossible. They were written the way you document something unexpected but real. There were no disclaimers, no skeptical commentary, no attempt to reinterpret what was found into something more acceptable. The writers simply recorded what they saw or what witnesses reported, trusting that the reader would understand the significance. Because, at the time, they did. That's what unsettled me the most. Not the size of the skeletons, but the normalcy of the reaction. In the 1800s, these discoveries weren't controversial. They didn't challenge a firmly established narrative, because that narrative didn't fully exist yet. Human history was still being pieced together. There was room for uncertainty, for anomalies, for findings that didn't immediately fit into a clean explanation. So when someone uncovered a massive human skeleton, it wasn't dismissed. It was noted. And then, it happened again. As my collection grew, the numbers started to matter. This wasn't 10 reports, or 20. It was hundreds, across decades, across states, across completely independent sources, each one adding another data point to something that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. Patterns began to emerge, not just in the descriptions, but in the circumstances of discovery. Many of these skeletons were found in burial mounds, ancient earthworks that predated modern settlement. Others appeared during large-scale construction projects, when the ground was disturbed in ways it hadn't been for centuries. Floods, erosion, digging moments when the earth briefly gave up what it had been holding. And what it revealed was consistent. Human remains, but not within normal limits. If even a fraction of these reports were accurate, they pointed to something that should have left a massive imprint on science, something that should have been studied, debated, preserved. But instead, it felt like these discoveries existed in a kind of historical blind spot, documented in their time, ignored in ours. I started asking a simple question. If these reports were false, why were there so many of them? And if they were true, why doesn't anyone talk about them now? Because by this point, the silence surrounding them felt louder than the reports themselves. There were no modern references, no widely accepted studies revisiting these claims, no preserved collections that matched the scale of what had been described. It was as if the entire phenomenon had been quietly pushed out of the narrative, not denied outright, just forgotten. And that kind of disappearance doesn't happen by accident, especially not at this scale, because losing one piece of evidence is understandable. Losing hundreds, each one recorded, measured, and reported across decades, suggests something else entirely. Not absence, but removal. By the time I finished organizing the early batch of clippings, one thing was clear. The story wasn't about whether these skeletons were found. The records said they were. The real question was why those records seemed to lead nowhere. No conclusion, no preserved evidence, no continuation, just a trail that suddenly stopped, as if someone, somewhere, had decided that this was as far as the story was allowed to go, and I hadn't even reached the most disturbing part yet. At first, I thought the pattern was in the numbers, the repeated heights, 7 feet, 8 feet, occasionally more. That alone was enough to raise questions, but numbers can be exaggerated, measurements can be wrong. Human error is always an easy explanation. But then I stopped focusing on how tall they were, and started looking at how they were described. That's when things became harder to dismiss. Across dozens, then hundreds of reports, certain details kept appearing, not once or twice, but over and over again, in articles separated by years, by states, by completely different reporters who had no reason to copy each other. The skulls. They were almost always described as unusually large, but not just in proportion to the body. Thick, dense, sometimes so large that witnesses claimed they could fit over a normal person's head like a helmet or a mask. That's not a vague exaggeration. That's a very specific observation. Then there were the jaws. Multiple reports mentioned jawbones far larger than expected, wide, heavy, and in some cases, described as containing what appeared to be double rows of teeth. Not broken fragments, not deformities. Structured, repeated features noted by different observers who had never met. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was poor understanding of anatomy. Maybe people misinterpreted damage to the remains. Maybe time had distorted what they were seeing. But that explanation started to fall apart the more I compared the reports. Because the descriptions didn't feel confused, they felt careful. Measurements were often precise down to inches. Bone lengths were recorded. Proportions were noted in ways that suggested the observers knew exactly what a normal human skeleton should look like and recognized that this wasn't it. And that matters more than it seems. People in the 19th century weren't disconnected from death the way we are now. They prepared bodies for burial. They saw human remains. They understood, in a very direct way, what a human skeleton looked like. So when they described something as human, but larger, thicker, different, they weren't guessing blindly. They were comparing it to something familiar, and consistently concluding that it didn't match. The femur's thigh bones were another repeating detail. Several reports described them as significantly longer than average, sometimes exceeding normal proportions by over a foot, and yet the overall structure of the skeleton remained unmistakably human. Not animal, not something unrecognizable. Human. Just scaled beyond expectation. That distinction appeared again and again. Whatever these people were seeing, they weren't confused about its category, only its size. And then there was something even harder to explain. Consistency across distance. Think about it. Different states, different excavation sites, different decades. No centralized communication, no internet, no shared database of giant skeleton characteristics that people could reference or copy. And yet, the same anatomical features kept showing up. Larger skulls, thick bones, oversized jaws, occasional mentions of double teeth, proportions that remained human, just amplified. If this were a series of mistakes, they shouldn't align this well. Random errors produce random results. But this wasn't random. It was structured, predictable, repeatable. And that raises a much bigger problem for the official explanation. Because it's one thing to say a farmer might mistake an animal bone for something unusual. It's another to suggest that hundreds of people across different regions and time periods all made the same specific mistakes, in the same specific ways, while recording nearly identical details. That's not how misunderstanding works. That's how observation works. The more I read, the more uncomfortable the conclusion became. These reports didn't sound like people imagining something extraordinary. They sounded like people documenting something real that didn't fit what we now accept as normal. And maybe that's the key. Because what we consider normal today is shaped by frameworks that didn't fully exist back then. Back then, discovery came first. Explanation came later. Now, it's often the other way around. We decide what's possible, and anything outside that boundary gets reinterpreted, dismissed, or ignored until it fits back inside. So I started asking a different question. Not, were these people wrong, but what if they were right? What if the details matched because they were describing the same thing, not imagining it? Because if that's true, then the problem isn't the reports. The problem is what happened after them. Because details like these shouldn't just disappear. They should accumulate. They should build into evidence. They should force investigation. But instead, they faded into silence. And the deeper I went, the clearer it became. The consistency wasn't the anomaly. The silence was. By the time I finished cross-referencing the descriptions, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about what was found. It was about where it was found. At first, the locations seemed scattered. Wisconsin, Ohio, Minnesota, Indiana, California. Reports spread across the map, disconnected at a glance. But once I started plotting them, something shifted. They began to cluster. Not randomly, not loosely, but with a precision that felt intentional. The highest concentration of these discoveries appeared in specific regions: the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi River Basin, and areas surrounding the Great Lakes. Places known for one thing above all else: ancient burial mounds. These weren't ordinary landscapes. Long before modern settlement, these regions were shaped by civilizations that left behind massive earthworks, geometric mounds, ceremonial sites, complex structures built with purpose and planning. And it was in these places that the skeletons kept appearing, again and again. Farmers digging into a mound to level land, construction crews cutting through elevated earth, floodwaters eroding riverbanks and exposing what had been buried for centuries. The pattern was consistent. Disturb the mound. Find the bones. That alone raises questions, because burial mounds are not accidental formations. They are deliberate, cultural, structured. They represent societies with rituals, hierarchies, and systems of belief about death and preservation. So if large human skeletons were repeatedly found inside these mounds, it suggests something far more significant than isolated anomalies. It suggests they were buried there, on purpose, and not just once. In several reports, multiple skeletons were discovered together, arranged in patterns, aligned in ways that implied intentional placement rather than random burial. Some accounts described rows. Others noted central figures surrounded by additional remains, as if indicating status or rank. These weren't chaotic graves. They were organized, which leads to an uncomfortable implication. If these individuals were buried with care, then whoever buried them recognized them as part of their own world. Not monsters, not myths, people, but people who didn't fit what we now define as normal human proportions. The more I examined the geographic clustering, the harder it became to support the idea of widespread misidentification. Because mistakes don't follow rivers. They don't concentrate around ancient construction sites. They don't repeatedly occur in the same cultural contexts, burial mounds, ceremonial grounds, areas rich in archaeological significance. But discoveries do. Real ones. And this pattern behaved exactly like one. There was also timing to consider. Most of these reports occurred during periods of active land disturbance, railroad expansion, agricultural development, early excavation efforts, moments when the ground was being opened on a scale that hadn't happened before. It was as if, for a brief window in history, the past was exposed all at once, and what emerged didn't fit expectations. But then something changed. As archaeology became more formalized, excavation didn't stop, but it became controlled, regulated, filtered through institutions that determined what was significant, what was publishable, what was worth preserving. And with that shift, the pattern didn't disappear, only the reports did. That distinction matters, because the land didn't change, the mounds didn't vanish. The regions that produced these discoveries are still there, still studied, still excavated under modern methods. So why did the outcomes change? Why do we no longer hear about these kinds of findings from the same locations that once produced them so consistently? It's easy to say the earlier reports were wrong, but that explanation doesn't account for the geographic precision. It doesn't explain why the same types of discoveries appeared in the same types of places, under the same conditions, over and over again. And it definitely doesn't explain why those discoveries seem to stop being acknowledged right around the time institutions took control of the narrative. Because if this were truly random error, it should have faded gradually, not vanished. Instead, what we see is something much sharper, a clear pattern of discovery, followed by a sudden absence of recognition, which suggests that whatever was being found didn't simply stop existing. It stopped being reported, and that raises a deeper question. What happens when a pattern in the real world collides with a framework that can't accept it? Because at that point, something has to give. Either the evidence changes, or the way we handle the evidence does. And as I moved into the next phase of this investigation, it became clear the explanation being offered for all of this wasn't nearly strong enough to carry the weight of what had been found. At some point, every anomaly meets resistance. Not curiosity, not deeper investigation. Resistance. By the time I reached this stage, I already knew what the standard explanation would be. It appears almost immediately whenever these reports are mentioned, repeated with quiet confidence as if it settles everything in a single sentence. Misidentification. According to this view, the people who reported these discoveries simply didn't know what they were looking at. They mistook animal bones for human remains. Fossils, mastodons, large mammals, ancient species were misinterpreted as giant human skeletons by observers lacking proper scientific training. On the surface, it sounds reasonable. Simple explanations often do. But the moment you compare that explanation to the actual reports, it starts to fall apart. Because the people describing these finds weren't just pointing at large bones and guessing. They were identifying human skeletons, and not vaguely. Specifically, they described skulls, rib cages, femurs, jaw structures, recognizable human anatomy. Not fragments, not isolated bones. entire skeletal frameworks arranged in ways that matched human form. That distinction is critical. Mistaking a single large bone for something unusual is one thing. Mistaking a complete human skeleton correctly structured, proportionally consistent, and often found in deliberate burial positions for an animal is something else entirely. And yet, that's exactly what the official explanation asks us to believe. That farmers, workers, and even local officials across multiple states, over decades, repeatedly made the same fundamental error, while recording detailed anatomical observations that aligned with one another. That they saw a rib cage and thought it was something else. That they measured a skull and didn't recognize it as human. That they documented femur lengths without realizing what they were holding. And not just once, hundreds of times. That's not just unlikely. It's statistically absurd. Then there's the issue of measurement. If these were random guesses or exaggerations, you'd expect round numbers: 7 feet, 8 feet, maybe 10. Clean, simple figures that feel more like estimates than actual data. But that's not what appears in the reports. Instead, you see specifics. 7 feet 4 inches, 8 feet 2, 9 feet 1. Numbers that suggest someone actually measured what they found using tools, not imagination. And they didn't just measure height. They recorded proportions, bone thickness, relative size comparisons, details that require observation, not assumption. So the question becomes unavoidable. How did so many people, in so many different places, make the same precise mistake in the same precise way? The official answer doesn't address that. It sidesteps it. And then there's another problem, one that's harder to ignore. If these discoveries were truly misidentified animal remains, why were they taken seriously at the time? Why were they reported in newspapers without correction or ridicule? Why were they collected, preserved, and in many cases, sent to scientific institutions for further study? Because that happened too. Again and again, the reports mention that the bones were not discarded. They were forwarded, handled with the assumption that they were significant, that they were worth examining, that they mattered. Think about that. If trained scientists of the time, people with far more anatomical knowledge than the average observer, received these remains, why didn't they immediately dismiss them as animal bones? Why isn't there a record of widespread correction, public clarification, articles explaining the misunderstanding? Instead, what we see is silence. The reports go in, the bones are sent away, and then nothing, no follow-up, no definitive debunking, no clear resolution. Just a quiet disappearance of both the evidence and the conversation around it. And that silence is doing a lot of work. Because if the explanation were truly that simple, if this were nothing more than widespread confusion, there should be a paper trail correcting it. Science doesn't just ignore errors at this scale. It studies them, documents them, uses them as examples. But here, that process seems to be missing, which raises a more uncomfortable possibility. What if the explanation isn't insufficient because it's incomplete, but because it was never meant to fully explain the evidence in the first place? What if it exists to close the conversation, not continue it? Because once you accept misidentification as the answer, the questions stop. You don't need to investigate further. You don't need to look for missing specimens. You don't need to reconcile conflicting details. Everything gets neatly filed away under mistake. Case closed. But the problem is, the details don't behave like mistakes. They behave like observations. Consistent, repeated, structured observations that point to something real, even if that something doesn't fit comfortably within modern expectations. And the more I examined the official explanation, the clearer it became. It wasn't strong enough to explain what had been found, but it was strong enough to make people stop asking about it. And maybe that was the point, because once the explanation is accepted, the investigation ends, and whatever lies beyond it stays buried. Up to this point, the pattern was unsettling but still open-ended. Strange discoveries, consistent reports, weak explanations. But there was one place where all of this should have converged, one place where uncertainty should have turned into clarity. An institution built for exactly this purpose. The Smithsonian. If even a fraction of those reports were accurate, then the remains those skeletons described in such detail had to go somewhere. They weren't left in the ground. They weren't casually discarded. Again and again, the articles mentioned the same next step. The bones were sent away, forwarded to experts, delivered to institutions, preserved for study. And more often than not, one name kept appearing as the final destination: the Smithsonian Institution. At the time, it was already becoming the central authority for American scientific research, a repository for artifacts, fossils, skeletal, remains, anything considered valuable to understanding history, biology, or human development. In other words, if giant human skeletons were being discovered across the country, this is where they should be. Studied, catalogued, preserved, documented for future generations. So I went looking for the records. Not the newspaper reports, I already had those. I wanted institutional documentation, intake logs, catalogue entries, research papers, storage records. Anything that could confirm what happened after these remains left the ground and entered the system that was supposed to protect them. And at first, it looked promising. Historical documents from the late 1800s did confirm that the Smithsonian received numerous skeletal remains from excavations across the United States. Their own reports referenced acquisitions from burial mounds, archaeological digs, and field researchers working in exactly the regions where these discoveries were being reported. That matched the pattern. That made sense. There were even references, brief but noticeable, to unusual specimens. Language that suggested some of these remains were considered significant, different enough to be mentioned separately. So far, everything aligned. The discoveries were made. They were documented. They were sent to the institution responsible for studying them. Exactly what should happen in a functioning scientific process. But then I tried to follow the trail forward. And that's where everything broke. Because when modern researchers ask a simple question, where are these skeletons now? The answer is always the same. They aren't there. Not misfiled. Not restricted. Not under special access. Gone. According to current records, the Smithsonian does not possess any collection of giant human skeletons matching the descriptions found in those historical reports. No preserved specimens. No accessible archive. No physical evidence that hundreds of such discoveries ever made it into their system. And that creates a contradiction that's impossible to ignore. Because we have documentation suggesting the remains were sent there. We have institutional acknowledgement that large numbers of skeletal materials were received during that exact period. But we do not have the remains themselves, which leaves only a few possibilities. They were lost, they were destroyed, or they were removed. Each of those explanations comes with its own problems. Losing a single specimen. That happens. Even a handful, over decades. Possible. But losing an entire category of material, hundreds of reported finds, many of which were explicitly described as significant, is something else entirely. That's not an accident. That's a pattern. And destruction. If the remains were deemed unimportant or misidentified, there should be records, disposal logs, documentation explaining why they were no longer worth preserving. Scientific institutions don't just eliminate material without a paper trail, especially not material that was once considered noteworthy. And yet, there's nothing. No clear documentation of systematic disposal. No detailed explanation of when or why these specific remains disappeared. Just vague suggestions, misplacement, poor cataloguing, damage over time. Excuses that might explain a few missing items, but not all of them. Not consistently. Not completely. Which leads to the third possibility. Removal. Not random. Not accidental. Deliberate. Because when you look at the scale of what's missing, the number of reports, the consistency of the descriptions, the clear path these remains took from discovery to institution, it becomes increasingly difficult to believe that everything simply vanished through neglect. Something doesn't add up. And the more I examined it, the more it felt like the absence itself was structured. Like a gap shaped with intention. Because if these skeletons never existed, there wouldn't be records pointing to them. And if they did exist, they should still be somewhere. Stored, archived, preserved. Unless, at some point, a decision was made, not about whether they were real, but about whether they should remain part of the record at all. And that possibility changes everything. Because it shifts the question from science to control. Not what was found, but what was allowed to be kept. And once you start asking that question, you realize something even more unsettling. The disappearance of the bones might not be the mystery. The real mystery is why their disappearance doesn't seem to bother anyone. At this point, the question wasn't whether something unusual had been discovered. It was what happened after. Because discoveries, no matter how strange, follow a process, especially once they enter an institution. They are logged, categorized, studied, sometimes reclassified, but always documented. there is always a trail. Or at least, there should be. So I stopped looking for the bones and started looking for the paperwork, intake records, transfer logs, internal correspondence, anything that could map the journey of these remains from the moment they were unearthed to wherever they ended up. Because even if the physical evidence was gone, the administrative record should still exist. And in some cases, it did. There were letters from field researchers describing shipments being sent to Washington, reports referencing collections of skeletal material arriving from excavation sites across the country, mentions of artifacts and remains being catalogued for further study, fragments of a process that clearly existed, but only fragments. Because when you try to follow any one of those threads to its conclusion, they stop, not with a final entry, not with a conclusion, just absence. No definitive catalogue number tied to a specific giant skeleton. No detailed analysis published in scientific journals explaining their structure or dismissing their significance. No internal documents outlining a decision to reclassify or discard them. It's like watching a trail of footprints in the snow that suddenly ends in the middle of an open field. No turn, no backtrack, just gone. And that kind of disappearance is different from simple loss. Because loss leaves inconsistencies, partial records, conflicting data, clues that something used to be there but became disorganized over time. But this feels cleaner, too clean. Across multiple reports, multiple shipments, multiple references, there's no consistent follow-through, no systematic archive that matches the scale of what was reportedly received, which raises a question that shouldn't be this hard to answer. Where is the paper trail for the disappearance? If these remains were removed, there should be documentation. If they were destroyed, there should be authorization. If they were reclassified, there should be updated records reflecting that change. That's how institutions work, especially institutions built on preservation and knowledge. You don't erase evidence without leaving evidence of the erasure, unless the erasure itself was never meant to be visible. That idea sounds extreme at first, until you consider the alternative. Because the alternative requires believing that hundreds of documented discoveries entered a system designed to track and preserve them, and then vanished without leaving behind a coherent administrative trace. Not one or two, all of them. That's not just unlikely. It's functionally impossible under normal circumstances. So either the system failed completely, or it functioned exactly as intended. And that's where the discomfort sets in. Because if the system worked, then the absence of records isn't an accident. It's a result, a consequence of decisions made at some level, decisions that determined what would be kept, what would be studied, and what would quietly disappear without explanation. And here's the most unsettling part. You don't need to assume a grand conspiracy to reach that conclusion. All you need is a framework, a set of expectations about what reality is supposed to look like, what human history is allowed to include, what kinds of discoveries are acceptable, and which ones are not. Because once that framework exists, it doesn't take a coordinated effort to remove contradictions. It just takes consistency. Every researcher who encounters something that doesn't fit has a choice whether to push it forward or quietly set it aside. Every institution that receives anomalous material has a decision to make whether to highlight it or absorb it into obscurity. And over time, those small decisions add up, not into a visible act of suppression, but into a pattern of omission, a gradual filtering of reality, until what remains is not everything that was discovered, but only what fits. And everything else, it fades. Not because it never existed, but because it was never allowed to remain visible. By the time I reached this point, I wasn't just looking at missing bones. I was looking at missing processes, missing conclusions, missing accountability, a system that recorded the beginning of a story, but not the end. And when an institution can tell you how something entered its care, but cannot tell you how it left, that's not just a gap in knowledge. That's a gap in responsibility. Because somewhere between discovery and disappearance, a decision was made, and whatever that decision was, it didn't just remove physical evidence. It removed the ability to trace what happened to it, which might be the most effective way to make something disappear. Not by hiding it, but by making sure no one can ever prove where it went. And once that happens, the evidence doesn't just vanish, it becomes untraceable. And untraceable things are very easy to forget. By now, the pattern was undeniable. Reports of massive human skeletons appeared again and again throughout the 1800s. Different states, different witnesses, different contexts, but the same core details repeating with unsettling consistency. Then something happened. They stopped. Not slowly, not as if discoveries became rarer over time, but abruptly. Around the early 20th century, roughly the 1910s to 1920s, the reports didn't just decline, they vanished. Mainstream newspapers, which had once documented these finds with casual confidence, simply stopped mentioning them altogether. No more articles, no more local reports, no more quiet acknowledgements of unusually large human remains being uncovered. And that kind of clean break shouldn't exist, because the conditions that produced those discoveries didn't disappear. Excavation didn't stop. In fact, it expanded. The 20th century saw the rise of modern archaeology, more funding, more systematic digs, better tools, trained professionals replacing amateurs. If anything, the chances of uncovering unusual remains should have increased, not dropped to zero. The burial mounds were still there. The riverbanks still eroded. Construction projects continued to cut into untouched land. Everything that once revealed those skeletons was still happening. So why did the reports end? That question doesn't have an easy answer, but it does have a timeline, and the timing is difficult to ignore. Because the early 1900s wasn't just a transition period for archaeology, it was a transformation. This was when disciplines like anthropology and archaeology began consolidating authority. Universities formalized their programs. Museums became gatekeepers of knowledge. Standards were established for what counted as legitimate evidence and what didn't. In other words, this is when the framework was built. A framework that defined human history in specific terms. Human height exists within certain limits. Human evolution follows a particular path. Human variation, while real, does not extend beyond accepted biological boundaries. And within that framework, there is no place for giant human skeletons, not as a recurring phenomenon, not as a widespread reality. At best, they could exist as isolated medical anomalies, rare conditions, individual cases, exceptions that prove the rule, but not hundreds of consistent discoveries across multiple regions. That doesn't fit. So what happens when reality doesn't fit the framework? It doesn't necessarily get disproven. It gets filtered, reinterpreted, or simply not reported. Because by the time institutions control the flow of information, they don't need to erase discoveries directly. They just need to decide which discoveries are worth acknowledging and which ones are not. Think about the shift. In the 1800s, a farmer finds something unusual. It goes into the local paper. No barrier, no review board, no need for approval. By the 1900s, that same discovery would pass through layers of interpretation before reaching the public. Experts would examine it, classify it, decide how it should be understood or if it should be discussed at all. And that changes everything. Because once that system is in place, anomalies don't disappear from the ground. They disappear from the narrative. They get absorbed into technical reports, reclassified under safer explanations, or quietly set aside if they challenge established models too directly. And the public never hears about them, which makes the sudden silence in the newspapers even more significant. It's not evidence that the discovery stopped. It's evidence that the reporting did. That at some point, the decision was made, whether consciously or not, that these kinds of findings were no longer acceptable as public information, not because they were proven false, but because they didn't align with what was now considered possible. And once that boundary is set, everything outside it becomes invisible. Not literally, but effectively. Because if something isn't published, isn't discussed, isn't included in the official record, it might as well not exist. That's how entire categories of evidence can vanish without being physically destroyed. They are simply excluded, ignored until they fade from awareness, replaced by cleaner, more consistent narratives that don't leave room for contradiction. And over time, that absence becomes normal. Future generations grow up, never hearing about these discoveries. Researchers don't look for them because they've never been told to. And the idea that such findings were once common becomes unthinkable, which is exactly where we are now. Looking back at a century where these reports were everywhere, and wondering how something so visible could disappear so completely, because a gradual decline would make sense. A slow fading as discoveries became rarer. But that's not what we see. We see a line, a clear boundary between two eras. Before, when these discoveries were reported openly, and after, when they weren't reported at all. And lines like that don't just happen. They are drawn, whether intentionally or as a byproduct of changing systems, changing authorities, changing definitions of what is allowed to be true. And once that line is in place, crossing it becomes harder with every passing year, until eventually, no one even remembers that anything existed on the other side. By now, the pattern wasn't just about missing bones or vanished reports. It was about something deeper. A structure, a set of rules unspoken, but powerful, that determine what is accepted as real and what is quietly set aside. Because once you step back and look at the timeline, a different picture begins to emerge. In the 1800s, discovery came first. People found things, recorded them, and only then tried to understand what they meant. There was room for uncertainty, space for contradictions. The world wasn't fully mapped yet, especially when it came to human history. But in the early 20th century, that began to change. Knowledge became organized, disciplines became formalized, and most importantly, narratives became standardized. Anthropology, archaeology, and related sciences didn't just collect data anymore. They started building models, frameworks designed to explain human development in a coherent, consistent way. And those frameworks had boundaries. Human beings, as we understand them, fall within certain biological limits. Height ranges, skeletal proportions, evolutionary pathways, cultural development patterns, everything had to fit. Because without that structure, there is no unified understanding, only scattered observations. And that's where the problem begins. Because frameworks are useful until something appears that doesn't fit inside them. When that happens, there are only a few possible responses. You can expand the framework to include the new evidence. You can challenge the evidence and try to disprove it. Or you can ignore it. Not publicly, not explicitly, just quietly. And over time, that quiet becomes silence. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't necessarily about a single decision made in a single moment. It was about alignment, a gradual, systemic alignment of expectations. By the time modern scientific institutions solidified their authority, the idea of giant human skeletons didn't just lack evidence, it conflicted with the structure that had already been built. Accepting those reports as valid wouldn't just add a new detail to human history. It would force a re-evaluation of multiple assumptions at once. Biological limits, population distribution, cultural development, even timelines. Because if beings of that size existed in significant numbers as the reports suggest, then they weren't isolated anomalies. They were part of a broader reality, one that current models don't account for, and that creates tension. Not because the evidence is necessarily false, but because it's disruptive, and disruptive evidence is difficult to integrate, especially when an entire system depends on stability. So instead of being explored fully, it gets softened, reinterpreted, reduced to anomalies. Or, in many cases, left behind, not out of malice, not as part of some coordinated effort, but as a natural consequence of how systems preserve themselves. Because every field, every institution, every body of knowledge has a kind of inertia. It resists change, not completely, but enough to slow down anything that challenges its foundations. And over time, that resistance shapes what is remembered and what is forgotten. Which brings us back to the reports. Hundreds of them. Detailed, consistent, spread across decades. If they had aligned with the emerging framework, they would have been absorbed into it, studied, referenced, built upon, but they didn't align, so they were never fully integrated. And once that opportunity passed, once the framework solidified without them, they became increasingly difficult to reintroduce, because now they don't just require explanation, they require revision, and revision at that scale is rare. Not impossible, but rare. So instead, the easier path is taken. They are treated as errors, curiosities, footnotes, if they are mentioned at all, and eventually, they disappear from mainstream awareness entirely, which creates a strange kind of loop. The less something is discussed, the less real it seems. And the less real it seems, the less likely it is to be investigated, until one day, it reaches a point where even bringing it up feels unreasonable. Not because it's been definitively disproven, but because it no longer fits within what people are used to accepting. And that's where the real shift happens. Not in the ground, not in the discoveries, but in perception. Because once a framework defines the limits of what is possible, anything outside those limits doesn't just become unlikely. It becomes invisible. And invisible things don't get studied. They don't get preserved. They don't get passed down. They fade. Not all at once, but steadily. Quietly, until the only place they still exist is in fragments. Old newspaper clippings, forgotten archives, scattered records from a time before the boundaries were drawn, before the framework decided what the past was allowed to be. And once you see that, once you understand how easily something can be excluded without ever being directly erased, you start to realize something unsettling. The question isn't just whether the evidence was removed. It's whether we've been trained not to see it at all. At the beginning, the mystery seemed simple. Strange reports, unusually large skeletons, a pattern that didn't quite make sense. Now, at the end, the mystery is something else entirely, because it's no longer just about what was found. It's about what was allowed to remain. We started with hundreds of accounts, newspapers, field notes, local discoveries describing human skeletons far outside the accepted range. Not one or two anomalies, but a consistent thread woven through decades of documentation. Then the thread broke. The discoveries didn't get explained. They didn't get disproven. They just stopped being part of the story. And everything we've followed since points to the same uncomfortable conclusion. The evidence didn't have to be destroyed to disappear. It only had to be excluded. Because once something falls outside the framework of what is accepted, it enters a kind of limbo. Not officially false, but not officially real either. And things that exist in that space don't last. They aren't taught. They aren't referenced. They aren't passed down through institutions that define what knowledge is worth keeping. So, over time, they fade not because they lack substance, but because they lack visibility. And visibility, more than anything else, determines what survives. Think about what we actually have now. Not bones in museum cases, not widely accepted scientific studies, just fragments. Scattered articles from a different era, mentions in archives that few people ever look at, references without conclusions, questions without answers, and perhaps most telling of all, a complete absence of closure, because in a normal investigation, even if the original claims were exaggerated or incorrect, there would be a process of correction, a series of publications explaining the mistake, clarifying the findings, closing the loop. That's how knowledge stabilizes. But that never happened here. There's no definitive moment where the scientific community collectively examined these reports and said, this is what they were, and this is why they don't mean what people thought. There's just silence, a gap where an explanation should be. And gaps like that don't resolve themselves. They persist. They sit just beneath the surface, unnoticed by most, but never fully gone. Which leaves us with a final question, not about the past, but about the present. What do we do with something like this? Because there are only two real options. Either all of those reports across different states, different decades, different witnesses were fundamentally flawed, misidentifications, exaggerations, misunderstandings that somehow aligned in a way that made them look consistent, or they were pointing to something real, something that, for whatever reason, didn't make it into the version of history we inherited. Neither option is comfortable. One requires accepting that large numbers of people, over long periods of time, repeatedly got the same thing wrong in remarkably similar ways. The other requires accepting that something significant may have been left out, not erased dramatically, not hidden in secret vaults, but simply filtered out until it no longer mattered. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all, because we tend to imagine lost history as something dramatic, hidden treasures, secret rooms, locked archives waiting to be discovered. But what if that's not how it works? What if things don't disappear because they're hidden, but because they're ignored? Because they fall just far enough outside the boundaries of accepted knowledge that no one feels responsible for carrying them forward. If that's true, then the past isn't just shaped by what happened. It's shaped by what gets remembered. And what gets remembered is shaped by systems, frameworks, expectations, all the invisible structures that decide what counts as real. So when we ask, where did the bones go? We might be asking the wrong question, because the more accurate question is, where did the story go? At some point, it was everywhere. Printed, discussed, taken seriously enough to be recorded again and again. And now, it's almost nowhere, reduced to fragments that feel more like rumors than records. And yet, those fragments still exist. Quiet, persistent, unresolved, like pieces of a puzzle that no longer has a picture on the box. So this isn't really an ending. It's a threshold, a point where the evidence we have runs out, and interpretation begins, where certainty fades and questions take its place. And maybe that's where it was always meant to lead. Not to a definitive answer, but to a realization that history isn't just a collection of facts. It's a constructed narrative, one that can include or exclude, reveal or overlook, remember or forget. And once you understand that, once you see how easily something can slip through the cracks without ever being formally erased, you start to look at everything differently. Not just what is presented, but what isn't. Because sometimes, the most important parts of a story are the ones that didn't make it into the final version.